In programming, we have a very important concept called scope, which refers to the region of the code where a variable is defined. So in this example, we have this message variable. The scope of this variable is the greet function. It only exists inside of this function. So if we go outside of this function and try to print message, see what happens. As soon as I save the changes, we get this red underline, undefined variable message. And if we run our program, we get this name error. Name message is not defined. The same rule applies to the parameters of our functions. So if we add a name parameter here and then try to print it outside of the greet function, we get the same error. So the scope of the name and message variables are the greet function, and we refer to these variables as local variables in this function. They're local in this function, which means they don't exist anywhere else. And that means we can have another function, let's say send email, with a parameter with the same name. Here we can have a message variable, but this message variable is completely different from the message variable we have in the greet function. And of course, the same rule applies to the name parameters in these functions. They are completely separate. These local variables have a short lifetime. So when we call, let's say, the greet function and pass a name, Python interpreter will allocate some memory and have the name and message variables reference those memory locations. When we finish executing the greet function, because these variables are not referenced or used anywhere else, eventually they get garbage collected, which means Python interpreter will release the memory that allocated for these variables. So these are the local variables. In contrast to local variables, we have global variables. So if we move this message variable outside of the greet function, now it's a global variable, which means it's accessible anywhere in this file. So the scope of this variable is this file. We can use it anywhere in this file, in any functions or outside of a function. Now, for this reason, global variables stay in memory for a longer period of time until they are garbage collected, and you should not use them that often. In fact, global variables are really evil. So, as a best practice, create functions with parameters and local variables. Now, what if here in the greet function, we set message to, let's say, B. Now, let's delete this second function. We don't really need it for now. So we call the greet function. In this function, we assign a new value to the message variable. Now let's print this message and see what we get. What do you think we're going to get? Well, let's take a look. We get A. But didn't we change the value of message variable to B? Not really, because by default, Python interpreter treats this message variable as a local variable in the greet function, even though it has the same name as the global variable that we have on line 1. So these two variables are separate. Now, I've seen some tutorials or even books teaching you bad practices. For example, they show you how to modify the value of this global message variable inside of a function. Let me show you how to do that. But remember, this is a bad practice and you should avoid it at all times. I will explain the reason in a second. So these tutorials or books teach you to use the global keyword here and reference the message variable. When Python interpreter sees this line, it will realize that in this function, we want to use the global message variable. So it will not define a local variable in this function. Now with this change, if we run our program, you can see we get B on the terminal because in this function, we are modifying the value of the global message variable. Why is this bad? Because it is possible that you might have multiple functions that rely on the value of this global variable. If you accidentally or deliberately change the value of this global variable in one function, this might have a side effect in other functions. Those functions may not behave properly. And this way we can create a bug in our program. So, global variables have always been bad. This is not a Python thing. This is a discussion that's been going on for decades. Avoid them as much as you can. Or if there are situations that you really need to define a variable globally in a file, that's okay, but do not modify it in a function as you see here. This is a really bad practice. So that's all about local and global variables.